Right now, you can pull up a map of the entire planet on a phone in your pocket. Every coastline, every mountain range, every island smaller than a football field. That map feels like it always existed. It didn't. Every single line on it was walked, sailed, or barely survived into existence by people who had no idea what they were actually about to find. No satellites, no compasses, not for most of this story. Sometimes no boats built for open ocean at all. One species walked out of a single stretch of African land and generation by generation ended up occupying every landmass on Earth except Antarctica. Ice deserts colder than the inside of your freezer. Islands separated by open ocean too wide to see across. Mountains where the air itself is thin enough to kill an unprepared person in days. All of it conquered, mostly on foot or in a wooden hull, by people who usually died without ever knowing how far the journey would eventually go. This is the real version of that story, and it is slower, stranger, and far more insane than the neat little arrow map you saw in school. Multiple pieces of it weren't even confirmed by scientists until this year. There's a failed migration that vanished without a trace, a genetic bottleneck sitting inside your own chromosomes right now, a hybrid child born from two different species of human, and an ocean crossing so early it happened before the wheel existed. So let's start at the actual beginning, one single point on the map, because every person alive right now, including you, comes from the exact same original address. In 2017, in a remote stretch of Morocco called Jebel Irhoud, a team led by paleoanthropologist Jean-Jacques Hublin at the Max Planck Institute uncovered something that broke the accepted timeline completely. Skulls, teeth, and stone tools from at least 5 individuals, dated to roughly 300,000 years old. Before this discovery, the oldest confirmed Homo sapiens fossils came from Ethiopia, dated to about 195,000 years ago. This single find pushed the birth of our species back by more than 100,000 years in one announcement. And it wasn't in East Africa, where the cradle of humanity story usually gets told. It was in the north. The stone tools at the site belong to something called the Middle Stone Age tradition, using a technique called Levallois flaking. A toolmaker carefully shapes a stone core so that a single controlled strike pops off a nearly finished blade. That's not trial and error, that's planning several steps ahead, holding a mental model of a finished tool before a single strike has even happened. Which means our species probably wasn't born at one single campfire in one single valley at all. Hublin's own conclusion was blunt. If there's a Garden of Eden, it's the whole continent of Africa, not one spot on it. Populations scattered across the entire landmass, likely swapping genes, tools, and ideas with each other for nearly 300,000 years before any of them permanently left. So picture the actual starting line, not a single tribe in a single valley, a whole continent of scattered human groups slowly becoming us, while the rest of the planet sat completely empty of anyone like them. Then, at some point, walking out of Africa stopped being a fantasy and started being survival. Here's the part almost nobody explains properly. Africa wasn't always sealed off from the rest of the world by desert. The Sahara runs on a cycle, driven by slow wobbles in the tilt of the Earth itself, called Milankovitch cycles, repeating roughly every 20,000 years. Every so often, that wobble pushes monsoon rains further north, and the desert briefly turns green. Rivers appear where there's now only sand. Grasslands spread across what's now the harshest desert on the planet. Animals migrate through corridors that a few thousand years later will become lethal, waterless wasteland again. All of those green windows were the doors out of Africa, and they didn't stay open for long. The very first people to walk through those doors mostly didn't make it. In a cave on Mount Carmel in what's now Israel, called Mislia, researchers led by Israel Hershkovitz in 2018 found a jawbone, dated to somewhere between 177 and 194,000 years old, the oldest Homo sapiens remains ever found outside Africa by a huge margin. Hershkovitz put it plainly at the time. If modern humans were already out of Africa 180,000 years ago, our species must have originated even earlier than the Jebel Irhoud dates suggested. Not far away, at 2 more caves called Skul and Kavze, more early human remains were dated to somewhere between 90,000 and 120,000 years old. For a while, archaeologists assumed all of this was one continuous population, slowly working its way toward the rest of the world. It wasn't. The current picture is stranger and honestly a lot more tragic. Small waves of people pushed out of Africa again and again over 100,000 years, and most of those waves simply died out. Climate flipped back, the green corridor closed behind them like a door. The population trapped on the wrong side of it had nowhere left to go. No trace of their descendants shows up in anyone alive today. An entire attempt at leaving Africa, gone, with nothing left behind but a jawbone in a cave and a burial site full of people who never got any further than the tip of the Middle East. So, if you'd been placing bets 150,000 years ago on which species would eventually cover the whole planet, this one would have looked like a genuinely terrible bet. A soft, slow primate repeatedly trying to leave its home continent and repeatedly failing. Then, somewhere around 70,000 to 60,000 years ago, one wave finally didn't fail. Geneticists can actually see this exact moment written into your own DNA right now, whether you've ever thought about it or not. Every non-African population on Earth today traces its ancestry back through a genetic bottleneck from around this window, meaning at some point, the entire lineage of every non-African human alive today ran through a surprisingly small group of survivors, maybe a few thousand. Some estimates run even lower. That's not a metaphor, and it's not a rough guess dressed up to sound dramatic. That's the literal math sitting inside your chromosomes at this exact second. Nobody knows for certain what made this specific wave different from all the failed ones before it. Better tools, tighter social bonds inside the group, maybe, honestly, just better luck with which decade the weather happened to cooperate. But this time, once they were out, they didn't retreat, and they didn't quietly disappear from the fossil record. And when they finally pushed further into Asia and Europe, they ran into something that gets left out of almost every simplified version of this story. The world was not empty. Someone was already there, multiple someones in fact, and your ancestors were about to do something with them that most people genuinely don't expect. Neanderthals had already been living across Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before your ancestors arrived. Denisovans, a separate group barely known from anything but a single finger bone and a handful of teeth, had already spread across large parts of Asia. These weren't animals to simply walk past on the way to somewhere better. They were other kinds of human with their own tools, their own controlled fire, their own dead whom they sometimes deliberately buried. And when your ancestors ran into them, something happened that most people genuinely don't expect. They didn't just fight, they interbred. We know this with total certainty because of one of the most extraordinary scientific achievements of the last 20 years. Geneticist Svante Pääbo spent decades developing methods to extract usable DNA out of fossils tens of thousands of years old, eventually sequencing a full Neanderthal genome. In 2022, he won the Nobel Prize for it. His work proved that almost everyone with non-African ancestry today carries roughly 2% Neanderthal DNA, woven into your immune system, into your skin, in some people even into how their body handles altitude or cold or certain infections. And that last part isn't hypothetical. In 2020, Pääbo and researcher Hugo Zeberg published a study in Nature identifying a cluster of genes on chromosome 3 inherited directly from Neanderthal interbreeding roughly 50,000 to 70,000 years ago. That exact gene cluster turned out to be the single strongest genetic risk factor for severe COVID-19 and hospitalization from it, carried by about half the population in South Asia, roughly 1 in 6 people in Europe, almost non-existent in Africa and East Asia, since it only entered the human genome after contact that happened after some populations had already left the continent. An extinct species, gone for 40,000 years, still deciding right now in living hospitals who ends up more likely to end up on a ventilator. For populations across parts of Melanesia and Aboriginal Australia, the genetic legacy runs even deeper. Up to 4 to 6% of their genome traces directly back to Denisovans, a species science didn't even know existed until a single finger bone turned up in a Siberian cave in 2010. But the single most direct piece of proof came in 2018, and it's the kind of find that makes the whole story feel suddenly uncomfortably personal. In the same Siberian cave, researchers led by Viviane Sloan and Svante Pääbo at the Max Planck Institute analyzed a tiny bone fragment from a girl who died around 90,000 years ago. They nicknamed her Denny. Her full genome told an unbelievable story. Her mother was a Neanderthal. Her father was a Denisovan, not a distant hybrid population generations removed, a first-generation child, 2 entirely different kinds of human meeting and having a daughter.
To this day, she remains the only confirmed first-generation hybrid of two archaic human species ever discovered. One researcher not involved in the study
Put it simply afterward, hybrids like her were probably nowhere near as rare as anyone had assumed. They may have been common. Think about what that actually means for the story you're watching right now. The species that eventually mapped, sailed, and settled the entire planet didn't do it as some pure, isolated bloodline marching forward alone. It did it by repeatedly meeting, mixing with, and absorbing pieces of every other kind of human it crossed paths with along the way. Conquering the map wasn't the clean story of one species advancing in a straight line. It was a slow, tangled merger, and you are walking, breathing proof of that merger. With that settled, the migration kept moving east, and the terrain kept getting worse. Somewhere around the edge of Southeast Asia, migrating humans ran into a problem that no amount of walking could ever solve: a stretch of deep ocean water, known today as the Wallace Line, separating the Asian mainland from the chain of islands that eventually leads to Australia. Even during the deepest point of an ice age, when global sea levels dropped by well over 100 meters and entire land masses fused into single continents, this specific gap never closed. You could walk all the way to the island of Bali. You could not walk one step further than that. To get past it, you needed a vessel capable of surviving open water, out of sight of land, with absolutely no guarantee anything existed on the other side. And somehow, people did it. At a rock shelter in northern Australia called Majetbebe, archaeologist Chris Clarkson at the University of Queensland led excavations that dated human occupation to around 65,000 years ago. Stone tools, grinding stones, ground pigment used deliberately as paint, not as an accident of geology. The dating is still debated by some archaeologists, who argue the more conservative, widely accepted evidence points closer to 50,000 years. But even the cautious estimate means the same staggering thing. People crossed open ocean on purpose in vessels good enough to carry a viable founding population, tens of thousands of years before farming, before the wheel, before writing, before almost anything you'd normally call civilization. Stop and actually sit with that for a second. The first confirmed open ocean voyage in the entire history of our species happened before nearly every other invention people usually associate with human progress. That single crossing may be one of the boldest technological leaps our species has ever made. It happened deep in the Ice Age, using rafts or boats that left absolutely no physical trace anywhere in the archaeological record. We don't have the vessel, we only have the proof on the far shore that it worked. Real quick, because this next stretch of the map only gets more insane from here. If a story like this, real events, real research actually being laid out properly instead of dumbed down, is worth your time, hit subscribe now. It genuinely helps a channel like this keep affording the kind of deep research a topic like this actually deserves. Alright, back to the map. Because reaching Saul, the ancient combined landmass of Australia and New Guinea, wasn't the finish line, it was proof of concept. If humans could cross open water like that, almost nowhere left on the map was truly safe from them anymore. So the migration kept splitting, kept spreading, and kept running straight into environments that should have been physically impossible to survive in. Take the Tibetan Plateau. Average elevation over 4,500 meters, oxygen levels low enough that lowland humans can develop dangerous fluid buildup in the brain within days of arriving. And yet, people have lived there for thousands of years, not just surviving, but thriving, working, having children, growing old. In 2014, geneticist Emilia Huerta Sanchez and her team published research in the journal Nature explaining exactly how. A gene called EPAS1, which helps regulate how the human body handles low oxygen, shows up in Tibetans in a version that barely exists anywhere else on Earth, except in one place, the Denisovan genome. That's right, the same mysterious archaic humans your ancestors interbred with thousands of miles away and tens of thousands of years earlier handed down the literal genetic tool that let their descendants conquer one of the harshest environments on the planet. And here's the detail that makes this even stranger. In 2019, a research team led by Dongju Zhang at Lanzhou University confirmed that a jawbone found decades earlier in a cave called Baisha on the Tibetan plateau itself belonged to a Denisovan.
dated to roughly 160,000 years old. The Denisovans weren't just donating a useful gene from somewhere far away, they had already been living on that exact mountain plateau over 3 kilometers above sea level 150,000 years before a single Homo sapien ever attempted it. A species that no longer exists is still, quietly, keeping people alive on a mountain plateau today every single time they take a breath, using a survival trick it had already tested on that same mountain long before you existed. Meanwhile, other branches of the same migration were solving completely different survival puzzles at the exact same time, thousands of kilometers apart. In the deserts of Central Australia, temperatures swing from scorching daytime heat to freezing desert nights, with almost no permanent water source for hundreds of kilometers in any direction. Aboriginal Australian communities didn't just survive there, they built one of the longest continuously maintained cultures on Earth, tracking water, seasons, and land through knowledge passed down for thousands of years, largely without a single written word. Further north, other branches were pushing into brutally cold Siberian and Arctic environments. In 2015, geneticist Matteo Fumagalli and his team published research in Science on Greenlandic Inuit populations, identifying a gene called CPT1A. A variant of it, almost completely absent everywhere else on the planet, showed up in over 3/4 of the Greenlanders they studied. The gene changes how the body processes fat, an obvious advantage for a population surviving for thousands of years on a diet built almost entirely around marine fat, seals, whales, and fish, in one of the coldest inhabited environments on Earth. Different branches of the exact same species, spreading in every direction at once, each one quietly rewriting its own biology to fit an environment that, on paper, should have killed them. And one of those branches was about to attempt something even more extreme than any of this, walking into the coldest, most hostile corridor on the entire migration route, toward a continent nobody from your lineage had ever set foot on, the Americas. For most of the 20th century, the accepted story here was simple. Around 13,000 years ago, hunters known as Clovis crossed a land bridge called Beringia, connecting Siberia to Alaska, once falling sea levels exposed it. Clovis first. Clean, tidy, done. Their signature fluted spear points, expertly shaped to lock securely onto a wooden shaft, have been found across huge stretches of North America, often lodged directly in the ribs of mammoths. But before any of them ever crossed into the Americas at all, genetic evidence points to something stranger happening back in Beringia itself. It's called the Beringian standstill hypothesis, first proposed by researcher Erica Tom and colleagues in 2007. The idea is that a founding population didn't cross straight through Beringia at all. They got stuck there, isolated on that exposed strip of Arctic steppe tundra, cut off from both Asia behind them and an ice-sealed Americas ahead of them, potentially for thousands of years through the coldest stretch of the entire last ice age, an entire population frozen in place, geographically and genetically, waiting for a door that hadn't opened yet. Then, eventually, it did. The story doesn't end there, though. It was about to get blown wide open by a set of footprints in a New Mexico desert. At White Sands National Park, ancient human footprints were found preserved in what used to be the muddy shore of a shallow Ice Age lake. In 2021, researchers dated seeds embedded in the exact same layer as the footprints, and the results were almost unbelievable, somewhere between 21,000 and 23,000 years old. That's roughly 8 to 10,000 years earlier than the old Clovis first timeline ever allowed for. And the footprints themselves tell an almost unbearably human story once you actually look closely at them. Small footprints belonging to a child walking alongside larger adult prints, in some sections clearly being carried, based on the changing depth and stride pattern in the mud. In another trackway, human footprints appear to deliberately follow the tracks of a giant ground sloth, stepping carefully inside its own prints, a pattern researchers interpreted as possible evidence of stalking or hunting behavior. These weren't abstract data points on a chart. They were a family, and possibly a hunt, frozen into mud for over 20,000 years. The scientific community, understandably, did not just accept the original dating quietly. So in 2023, a team led by USGS researchers Jeff Pigatti and Kathleen Springer went back and tested the same footprints with two completely independent methods: radiocarbon dating of ancient pollen and a technique called optically stimulated luminescence, which measures the last time buried quartz grains were exposed to sunlight, published in the journal Science. All three methods, using three unrelated approaches, landed on the same answer. Humans were already standing in what's now New Mexico, more than 21,000 years ago, while a wall of ice still sealed off most of the route that was supposedly the only way in, which raises an obvious, slightly unsettling question. If the interior land route was still frozen shut, how did they actually get that far south? The leading theory now involves the coast, not the interior, a slow migration by boat and on foot hugging the Pacific shoreline, living off kelp forests, seal shelf, and coastal wildlife the entire way, while the interior of the continent remained an impassable wall of glacial ice, an entire secret entrance into a continent, walked and paddled in by people who left almost nothing behind except a few dozen footprints in fossilized mud. And once that door was open, the spread was almost shockingly fast. At a site called Monteverde in southern Chile, archaeologist Tom Dillahay uncovered wooden structures, hearths, tools, and even preserved plant remains dated to at least 14,500 years old. Chile, the literal opposite end of two entire continents from Beringia, which means within just a few thousand years of that first uncertain crossing near the top of the map, descendants of the exact same migration were already standing at the very bottom of it. Two continents walked and paddled end to end faster than most people would guess is even physically possible without an engine. And they weren't just passing through quietly. Roughly 1,000 years later, Clovis hunters were bringing down mammoths across North America with those same fluted stone points. And within a relatively short window afterward, a huge share of the continent's largest animals, mammoths, giant ground sloths, mastodons, simply vanished from the fossil record. Whether humans, a shifting climate, or some combination of both did the most damage is still genuinely debated among researchers. But the timing on both continents is difficult to ignore. By this point in the story, look at what the map actually looks like. Africa, Asia, Europe, Australia, North America, South America. Every single one occupied. Only one significant piece of the puzzle was still sitting there completely empty for thousands of years after everything else was already claimed. The Pacific. Not a handful of scattered islands, roughly 1/3 of the entire surface of the planet scattered with tiny specks of land separated by open water in every direction. And solving it required something even more advanced than anything used to reach Australia or the Americas. Around 3,000 years ago, a seafaring culture archaeologists call the Lapita began pushing east out of the Bismarck Archipelago, near modern-day Papua New Guinea. Distinctive pottery found scattered across thousands of kilometers of islands marks their trail. Deliberate, planned voyages, not accidental drifting. Over the following centuries, their descendants, the ancestors of modern Polynesians, kept pushing further and further into open water, island by island. And they did it without a compass, without a sextant, without any writing system to record directions for the next generation. Instead, they memorized the sky, the exact rising point of specific stars on the horizon. The direction and rhythm of ocean swells felt directly through the hull of the canoe itself. Cloud formations that hinted at land hundreds of kilometers before it became visible. Bird flight patterns at dusk which revealed which direction the nearest island actually was. This system is called wayfinding. And for a long time, plenty of Western academics simply refused to believe it was real, insisting instead that the Pacific was settled by accident, canoes drifting on ocean currents with no real intention behind them. In 1976, that theory got directly, publicly tested. A group called the Polynesian Voyaging Society built a traditional double-hulled canoe named Hokulea and set out to sail it from Hawaii to Tahiti, roughly 4,200 kilometers away, using nothing but traditional navigation. There was one problem. By the 1970s, the art of wayfinding had nearly vanished from Hawaii entirely. So they searched the Pacific for anyone who still carried the knowledge. They eventually found Mau Pialug, a master navigator from the tiny Micronesian island of Satawal, one of the last handful of people on Earth trained in it since childhood. For 31 days, Pialug read the ocean like a book, the angle of the swells under the hull, the color of the water, the rising points of stars through the gaps in the clouds, flights of birds heading toward land he couldn't see yet. With no compass, no charts, and no radio contact for navigation, he guided the canoe directly to the island of Tahiti. 17,000 people were waiting on the shore when it arrived. It wasn't just a celebration, it was proof. Proof that the ancestors of Polynesia hadn't simply drifted across the largest ocean on Earth by luck. They had navigated it, deliberately, using a science so precise it could still guide a wooden canoe across thousands of kilometers of open water 6 centuries later with total accuracy. Island by island over those centuries, the map kept filling in. Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, eventually the remote, brutal isolation of Easter Island and the lush volcanic chain of Hawaii. But one significant landmass held out longer than almost anywhere else on Earth: New Zealand. While pyramids were already ancient history, while entire empires had already risen and collapsed across Europe and Asia, New Zealand sat completely untouched by a single human footprint. Then, sometime between roughly 1250 and 1300 CE, Polynesian voyagers finally reached it, sailing double-hulled canoes across almost 3,000 kilometers of open Pacific Ocean from eastern Polynesia. A 2022 study modeling a huge dataset of radiocarbon evidence narrowed that window down to just a few decades within that range. These voyagers became the ancestors of the Maori people. And with that landing, something happened that had never once happened before in the entire history of our species. Every major landmass on Earth now had people standing on it. The map, the one you can casually pull up on your phone right now without thinking twice, was finally completely full. It took roughly 300,000 years from a scattered handful of communities across Africa to get there. It took failed exoduses that vanished completely, leaving nothing behind but a jawbone in a cave. A genetic bottleneck so narrow that your entire ancestry outside Africa runs through a group that may have numbered only a few thousand people, interbreeding with at least 2 other kinds of human that no longer exist, close enough that one of them left behind an actual daughter, and close enough that that encounter still shapes who gets hospitalized during a modern pandemic. An ocean crossing to Australia that predates the wheel. A hidden coastal migration into the Americas walked by people who left behind nothing but a few dozen footprints in fossilized mud. And a final voyage across the widest ocean on the planet, guided by nothing but memorized stars and the feel of the swell under a wooden hull. Here's a real question for you, and I honestly love to know the answer. Out of every single crossing in this story, the deep water leap to Australia, the hidden coastal walk into the Americas, or the open ocean voyage to New Zealand, which one do you think took the most raw guts? Drop it in the comments. I genuinely read every single one of them. And if this is the kind of real, deeply researched story you want more of, tap like before you go. It's a small thing, but it's the main way content like this actually finds the people who'd want to see it. So look at that map on your phone one more time. Every border, every coastline, every remote island you've never even heard of is standing exactly where it is because someone, at some point, decided the horizon was worth the risk. Not a general, not an empire, not a single hero with a plan. Just ordinary people, generation after generation, walking a little further or sailing a little further, surviving one more impossible stretch of land or water than the group before them. They didn't know they were conquering a planet. They just knew there was something past the horizon, and they wanted to find out what it was. You're the answer to that question. Every single one of them made it far enough, for long enough, for you to be the one sitting here watching the story end.